All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Hillary. I'm one of the co-directors of programming at BPMA, along with my colleagues Prachi and David, who will be, Prachi will be joining in a bit. It's great to see you guys. We are super excited for today's session, which is how to excel as a data product manager. So I'm going to kick it off with just a couple of quick introductions related to, what is BPMA in case this is your first time joining, and some kind of guidelines for the session and how the session will go. And then I will kick it over to Michael, our presenter. All right. So quick agenda. Like I said, I'll do a quick kickoff and intro to BPMA, just a couple minutes. We'll hand it over to Michael for the majority of the hour for a presentation on data-driven product management. And then we'll set aside some time at the end for any Q&A that we don't get to throughout the session. I'll mention this in a few minutes and a few slides, but make sure to, as we go, any questions you have at all related to the topic, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will do our best to either answer them as we go or answer them at the end. So some quick guiding principles for the session. We definitely encourage, not required, I know it's lunchtime for those on the East Coast, so if you're eating lunch and want to stay off camera, feel free. But we definitely want this to be, a community of like-minded individuals and promote connection and networking. So if you are comfortable and can do it, feel free to leave your camera on so we can get to know you and your faces. And we see you again in a future session. We'll make sure to keep an eye out. And then in the Zoom chat, what we ask people to do at the beginning of the session, just to kind of do some introductions offline and plant some seeds for networking, is just share your name, your title, your organization and industry, and then your location. So feel free to drop that in the chat. And if you see anybody you want to connect with, you can reach out separately. And then again, ask questions as we go. So these sessions are really for you guys. We want to make sure that you get all your questions answered. Anything that we don't get to in the session, I like to send a follow-up email with a link to the recording and any kind of Q&A that we might not have gotten to. All right, who is BPMA? Who are we? So we are a professional organization in the greater Boston area. Obviously, we're remote these days for now, so we're happy to welcome a wider audience as well, not just those located in Boston. But we're really dedicated to career development of folks who are interested in product management and product marketing, whether you're currently in that field or you're kind of an aspiring product professional. And we offer a lot with the BPMA membership, which you can learn more about at our website. So things like monthly events, some content on our blog, and a mentorship and job board opportunities. So you can definitely learn more about mentorship program, which I'll show on the next slide, and take a look at our job board, which is open to the public right on our website as well. All right, we are sponsored by a number of organizations in the product field or related who are really great resources if you want to check them out. So thank you to our sponsors. And for those who are job seekers or interested in more professional development in the product space, again, feel free to check those out as well. As I mentioned, we have a public-facing job board on the website. So this is just a quick sampling of a few of the job openings that are up there right now. You've got the title, years of experience, a link to the posting itself, and then the information for the hiring contact as well. And then, as I mentioned, we have a mentorship program. So there's a few different tracks related to whether you are kind of an aspiring product professional or someone already in the field who's looking to grow your skills. So feel free to look that up on the website as well and submit an application if you're interested. And then we also have again, part of our kind of objective as an organization is to promote networking. And so we have, with your membership, you get access to our Slack community, where we have almost 1,000 members within the Slack community today. And we've got dedicated channels for different areas that you might be interested in. So events, career advice, jobs, women in product, a number of other kind of thematic channels there. And then the last thing I wanted to mention before we kick it off is our events. If you check out events at the top of the website, we've got a couple of upcoming events posted that you can register for now. So in June, in mid-June, we have a panel presentation on product strategy. So we'll have a number of product professionals who can speak to what is a product strategy, what does a good one look like, what is it not, how can we all contribute to our organization's product strategy or help to create one if there is not one guiding our teams. So definitely check that one out. It is similar time as today's session. And again, just a few folks on a panel. And then we also have an event later in June for building an interview roadmap for exceptional interview outcomes. So if any of those topics sound interesting to you, feel free to head over to our website and register for them today. They're both free. All right, so I am going to stop sharing now and introduce Michael, who is on the call, Michael Barros, who will just do a quick introduction and then jump into the presentation. But again, in the meantime, feel free to drop any questions as well as your introductions in the chat, and I will keep an eye on them as we go. I'm gonna stop sharing and over to you, Michael.
All right, can you all see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
Great. All right. Well, pleasure to meet you, everybody. My name is Michael Barros. I am currently the head of product at Surgo Ventures. Before that, I've been in a few different startup and growth stage companies in the Boston and Northeastern area. The majority of my career has been in data product management. And when I say that, I mean products that may be AI driven, may have surfaces, may not, right? So for context, it has been about 2 years since I have developed any products that have like an application, like a front end application aspect of them, right? There might be some analytics, dashboarding, looker, but by and large, I'm sitting inside of a database, working with people to try and figure out how do we find some of these deep-seated correlations? How do we build these AI engines? How do we build these databases to better support our initiatives? So why are we talking about this? At least from what I have found, I spent a number of years doing more of the traditional front-end product management for a number of years. And from what I'm seeing out there in the industry, more and more organizations are racking up data, right? And they see that as a strategic asset. And I can't tell you the number of times I've seen a CEO essentially just go, hey, we've got data. Why don't we like sprinkle some AI on that and get value, right? But that's really not how it works. So what I wanted to talk about today was for those people who maybe haven't been driving AI ML products, who maybe have been more on the front end side, how do you start to approach these problems? How do you frame these problems? And how do you write effective stories, right? We'll close out with the kind of skills that y'all can brush up on. And of course, also some Q&A. So please feel free, if you do have a question, I have no problem stopping along the way. Feel free to throw something in the chat and I'm happy to answer. So yeah, let's roll along. Step one, what's a data product manager? As I said, as doing business digitally has become table stakes, PMs have an opportunity to really drive distinct, unique value by learning how to wrangle, handle, and create value out of these data assets. Like I said, some examples of what I mean when I'm talking about data products could be advanced analytics, could be API first integration products, or it could be AI-based tools, chatbots, recommendation systems, etc. So the first thing that I want to talk about here is assessing the data at hand, right? Like I said, it's not uncommon to essentially like get an edict from on high, like we have to do data science now, we need AI, right? Now, what does that mean? As a PM coming in and going to your engineering team, how do you say, I want AI? At the end of the day, data, and you know, it hurts a little bit to say this, data in of itself is of marginal use, right? It's only when that data is mature and of quality that you are able to then determine what can we do with it, what can't we do with it, and how can we best leverage this going forward, right? At the end of the day, this is a framework that I have used with my coworkers to kind of articulate what are we doing with what's at hand, right? This is a common framework out there, the data maturity hierarchy. We've adapted it a little bit to think about exactly like to frame a given problem, right? So whenever you're approaching a problem, a use case, you are going to see that there are data in front of you that you can use to solve this problem. You're going to have to understand what's the level of data that I'm working with here and what can I then do with it, right? So in its most base form, we're dealing with raw data. Before we go into that, I want to kind of set up an example that we're going to use for the next few slides, right? I'm going to use my background because heck, that's where I come from. It's where I'm most comfortable, right? Say you're working with a B2B health tech company. Your job is to make sure doctors know everything they need to know within 5 minutes of meeting a patient. Real problem, something that I've worked on for a while, right? Ultimately, what ends up happening here is you're overflown with requests, right? Doctor has access to dozens of different types of data. You're talking about lab results. You're talking about notes that other doctors have taken. You're talking about EHR records, claims. Each one of these different pieces of data will have its own level of quality and maturity. The more mature and the higher quality a piece of data, the more you can do with it. However, the really dangerous piece here is when you start to overestimate danger or maturity, you get stuck in this cycle where what you're trying to do may not be impossible, but you're going to end up spinning your wheels because your data science team is going to be more than happy to try and execute for you, but without real features, without information and knowledge that's already been generated, they're kind of grasping at straws, and we'll elucidate that a bit more. So like I said, raw data, it's pervasive, it's everywhere. Think of this as completely transactional, right? This is the data that in many cases just powers a web app, right? It could be the data that's generated as the form of a transaction, right? When X happens, Y comes out. So if we were to think about this in, like I just said, that B2B health tech setting, every single time I'm a patient, I go to the doctor, I receive a claim code that says I have this condition, it costs this much to treat it, right? Those are transactions. For patients, this is just so broad, right? Like we talked about, there are dozens of different information sources. Right here is where you're going to first start getting situations where people ask for what they don't understand. As PMs, I'm sure we can all identify with that problem. You will get requests to say, just give me the raw data. Like I'm a doctor, I'm a subject matter expert. I know what I'm doing. Let me sift through the data. The biggest problem here is they're going to be drowned, right? Displaying raw data is sure to lead to information overload, and ultimately people don't really get what they're asking for here. Before displaying any raw data to end users, you need to first think about aggregating it into information, right? And this is where I believe like the product manager's job starts to plug in. Now, what's information? Information is raw data that's aggregated to inform me of something, right? Now, this is done by a PM, an analyst, whomever is in charge of creating these definitions through collaborative interviewing. You need to create definitions. Oftentimes, these definitions just have to be a mark in the sand. We are making a decision for now as to what constitutes this, but this will change over time. Let's go back to my example. I need to know what conditions Michael has, right? Now, let's say I have received an inhaler over the past couple of weeks after a bronchitis scare. Let's say I also went and got some blood tests because it was time for my annual go around. I went to my doctor, had a physical. Now, there are different ways here that I can say, what conditions does Michael have? Those blood tests may show an elevated A1C level that's indicative of diabetes, right? Does that mean we display it? The claim code that was listed along with my doctor's visit might say that I have mild diabetes, but that could be a mislabel, etc. So ultimately, this stage is all about sitting with those discrete data sources, sitting with your subject matter experts. Oops, sorry. And creating those definitions, evolving them over time. And ultimately, a big thing here for PMs is driving consensus. You are never going to land on a definition everyone agrees with. Even for something as basic as, does Michael have diabetes? There will not be agreement. You need to be able to place a line in the sand to say, if codes X appear, if this appears, this is our standard definition. It's critical if you are in like a knowledge industry area here that you have an SME. When I was doing construction technology, I was sitting here with safety experts for at least 10 hours a month, right? Trying to understand what's the difference between a risky observation and a medium risk observation. In the case of healthcare, what's the difference between a high risk patient and a medium risk patient? What's the difference between mild diabetes and moderate diabetes, right? You have to start to really hammer these home, because at the end of the day, if you try to move right from raw data to data science, you're going to end up with way too much noise in your model. It's possible. Like, this is an area where software development is a little bit different from data science development. You might run into a situation where somebody just tells you, I cannot build this piece of software. It is technically infeasible. Or, yes, I can. It is going to take me 10 months and 20 engineers. In data science, you are going to run into a lot of situations where it's pure ambiguousness. At some time, you might be able to train a model. How good it is up to a PM, right? Like, I have to make that judgment decision to say, is this accurate enough? For me, I can't model all that stuff off of raw data. I first need to be able to have common definitions. I need to have common features upon which to build these AI models. So this information stage, it's all about being able to take that raw data, organize it, aggregate it, and get people the key answers to questions they need. And that gets us to knowledge, right? Knowledge is where you do start to get into some of the things that people immediately recognize as value. This is where you start to think about understanding the context around situations, right? Essentially your data modeling. Here, I might want to know what led up to Michael getting his first diabetes diagnosis. What were key factors that led up there, right? Now, a lot of these might be intuitive, right? You don't necessarily need a super advanced deep learning model to know that when somebody's blood or A1C levels are above X, they're at risk. You might need an advanced machine learning model to find out that a certain region of the country has an elevated risk over others, right? You've got to match form with function. So what you really want to do across this entire data hierarchy is never overinvest in AI you don't need. Far too often, what I see in industry is throwing on essentially like a giant Cadillac engine to solve what is a very basic question. Let me give you an example. In the healthcare world, I need to know if I am going to reach out to this given member, this member who has diabetes. I want to engage them in a care management program. I want to be able to have a nurse meet with them once every couple of weeks, provide them with literature, and provide them with as much support as possible for them to intervene and take care of their condition, right? So it is critical to me as a clinician to know what are the leading indicators of success and what are the leading indicators of failure, right? It would be very critical for me to know how often is so-and-so taking their blood test, right? Are they adhering? Again, do I need massive AI to do that? No, I need an analyst and some SQL skills, but just being able to know that suddenly drives significant value to our end users, right? Ultimately, getting into this wisdom area is where you really do start to think, I need advanced artificial intelligence, I need deep learning, right? This is where you move away from observations and move towards the predictions of the future. So, for example, here, this is not about knowing that Mike has diabetes. This is about looking at Mike's current state and saying, unless you do something about it, Michael, you are going to develop diabetes in the coming months. And here are the steps you can take to intervene on that behalf. Now, let's talk about this through the lens of human cognition first. So we've got this top to bottom hierarchy, right? Raw data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. that is completely, what's the word I'm looking for here? Like just implicit to the way that we think, right? When you look around the world, you are automatically aggregating all of the signal you collect into wisdom, right? When you are looking at, I'm looking at a wall in front of me, I'm not going, okay, so there's a line, it's red, there are multiple of them, and now I'm gonna aggregate this up. We have a wall generally, and inside of the wall is the component of a window. That's how these AI systems are working, right? You really have to start to break down what are the core components at each level in order to build more advanced stuff down the line. It is only possible to really start developing some of these more advanced complex use cases if you take all of the steps previously. Let me take a little bit of a tangent. Something that I have found universal is if you are working with data scientists or statisticians, often in your work, one thing that they'll come back to you oftentimes is stop feature engineering me. And I spoke with a lot of PMs about this. A lot of them don't necessarily know what that's asking, right? What do you mean stop feature engineering me? This is the practice of a PM essentially walking into a room and saying, hey, we have data point X. That should be very predictive. Can't we now predict Y? So a good example here, hey, we just got new data that shows us the lab results for every American. Can't we now predict who is going to develop diabetes in the next 6 months? Well, the data that we got was transactional, right? I see Hillary's submission from December 21st, 2001. I see her separate one from December 21st, 2022. We have to aggregate that into information. What does Hillary's longitudinal testing look like? What does the traditional testing look like for someone who has diabetes, somebody who develops it? There are a lot of steps along the way, and those first steps are having shared definitions. Now, separately from quality, separately from maturity, there are also aspects of quality that you have to dive in on. That first set, the maturity, was really about framing the problem at hand, right? You've got some kind of problem to solve. You have got some kind of task you've been given. You've got assets in front of you. You've got a ton of data. How do you frame up what is feasible, what isn't, and how do you engage with your technical stakeholders? This next stage is more about actually writing those stories and understanding what you're asking for at a more minute, granular detail. So I would say there are 4 major areas of quality that PMs should be writing for in their tickets. If you are asking somebody to develop a new database for you, if you are asking for a new set of tables, if you are asking for an AI system that's going to be in production, you are going to be responsible for all of these aspects, right? Accuracy. When you think about this, this is the degree to which data reflects the real world. Now, I would always recommend having a metric in your acceptance criteria to check for this. Let me give like a concrete example, right? This is the false positive problem. There are going to be situations where the data in front of you does not match the real world. One could be within the healthcare sector. I have got a situation in which Michael was falsely diagnosed for diabetes, right? You know, I might be able to look into Michael's record. I can see 100,000 claims related to Michael over the past 35 years, but only one claim shows diabetes, right? Is that an accurate claim or not, right? So you have to start scoping in how accurate are these, but also how complete are they, right? So if I'm creating a product that is going to be utilizing multiple different data sources, the last thing I want to do as a developer is have to reference table 1 over here, table 2 over here, table 5 over here, and table 32 over here in order to create one coherent product, right? Completeness refers to whether or not all of the data is present within a set, right? I want to avoid multiple joins in order to put something into production. So any base model you're working off should include a check for the percentage of null values in your database, right? Let me give a very concrete example here. In the healthcare space, claims are often incorrect. I'll just call it what it is. Recent studies have shown up to 60% of claims have errors in them. Now, one of the things that is most commonly missing from claims data is gender. So I'll give an example a couple of months ago where somebody tried to create a predictive model to identify members who were pregnant, ideally in their first trimester, with the theory being we can engage them, provide them with free services, free rides to their OBGYN, NICU vitamins, etc. Predictive model was created. Awesome. It theoretically worked until somebody realized there was a filter on that to only target women, right? People who in the gender, in their claim line had a women tag on them. The problem was over 80% of our members did not have a claims generated gender field. It was not complete, right? So that model that somebody spent weeks and weeks developing was essentially useless because the key feature, one of the key features that they were looking in on didn't exist. It was not complete. So as a PM, when you are starting to build into these, you have to get into that underlying data. You can't just rely on your technical partners. That pregnancy example also ties in here, timeliness, right? Depending on what your use case is, the time at which you receive given data may be critical. So let's go back to that example I just talked about. There were two reasons that model failed. The first was because we could not accurately target women. The second one was because even if you removed that failure, what we found was generally there's a 2 to 3 month lag between when Michael goes to the doctor and when Michael's claim is visible to a system, right? So if I am a pregnant member and I got my first doctor's appointment to find out I was pregnant 12 weeks in, theoretically, we are not getting that first claim until somebody is 7 months into their pregnancy, 5, 6, 7 months. That was the timeliness of the data coming into us was not taken into consideration. So ultimately, the use case that was in mind for this was a failure, right? We could not detect women early enough, nor were we able to filter down to just women. So finally, we get into validity, right? This reflects how well the data conform to expected behavior. This is often overlooked and a chronic problem that I have seen, especially if you're in some of the smaller startup organizations. This is really just a standard check. This is something your technology partner should be helping you out with all the time, right? What you need to know is this data conforming to the expectation? I actually do see this all the time where you will see, essentially, is this supposed to be a true false field, but you have got something non-conforming. You have suddenly got a string where you were supposed to have something else. So this just helps you understand that quality of your data. So at the end of the day here, how this comes together, if you're a data PM, you're going to be owning certain tables, right? They're not going to be on you as they would with like a technical individual, but you're still responsible for the performance and the applications and the products that are generated off of those tables. That data quality framework is going to enable you to create quality tickets. It's going to enable you to make sure that the databases you're working on top of are solid and make sure that the data products that you're building on top of that data have been quality checked. Any story you're writing should be addressing things like completeness, accuracy, timeliness. Data maturity, on the other hand, is really about framing what is capable with the current state of the state. If you dive in and you see that you've got a sea of transactional data, but you can't see the timeline within a given person, for example, you know that your next step is creating information. Your next step is creating analytics. Your next step is not creating deep learning models. So skills to brush up on for PMs who will be in this space. Number one, SQL, absolutely critical. For myself, I'll say that I probably don't go a couple of days without at least needing to reference SQL. This I also find, especially if you are targeting some of those early stage startups is an incredibly valuable skill because you're able to be a bit of a player coach. At the end of the day, I find that there are a lot of transferable skills between analysts and PMs, namely a massive curiosity and a desire to document things. If you know SQL, you are able to fulfill that analyst role. You are able to, as a PM, ask questions of the data and deliver value without having to sit on your hands, right? Pursuant to that, there's also DBT. Now, I don't think y'all need to be developers by any means, but anyone who's going to be working in this space should be aware of these kind of modular SQL orchestration tools. More and more SQL is moving away from a language that used to be used just to like generate queries and get information, and more being used for active development purposes, right? SQL code is production code and needs to be treated as such. BI tools, I live in these things. Just a bit of context for you, it has been 2.5 years now since I have had any application that was surfaced in a way beyond Power BI applications, right? Like I personally am not managing a section of a mobile app or a section of a web app. I am living down low in the data, and when I do peek my head out, it's in the form of these BI tools. Here, if you know a little bit of SQL, goes a long way. But if you don't, this still gives you the ability to explore raw data, to find some of those deep-seated connections, and to present visualizations to your stakeholders. And this is just something I wish I knew about coming into these roles, right? Like at a high level, I'm sure many of you have seen things like schema and entity relationship diagrams. Knowing how to do this well is the difference between completely functional work and completely non-functional data work, right? This is also just how you articulate communication in the data world. This is how you talk about how systems talk to one another. Absolutely critical to get really strong here. So a little bit quick, but that is about what I've prepared today, and I'd love to open it up for any questions. Oh, sorry, we had some. I just had the chat bar closed. So let me go backwards. Questions?
That's okay. And I think the first couple were from me, so I don't mind just asking them.
Please go for it, Hillary.
You don't have to scroll back. Thank you so much. So one question that I had, let me just open it back up. So something that I sometimes struggle with is knowing how to start with good questions that I want to ask using data. Sometimes it's easy to fall in the trap of, if you're getting comfortable with it, looking at data that's available, looking at data visualizations to understand like, what are our users doing, what's happening in our platforms. But I sometimes have a hard time stepping back to think about what are the questions that I really want to ask. Any suggestions on like how best to think about that?
Yeah, so there are two paths I go down. There are two ways I think about this. One is, am I using data to answer some kind of customer question, right? Or some kind of stakeholder question? In which case, before I do a thing in SQL or dive in, I'm going to use like a 5 why framework, right? Like, why do you need this? Why do you need this? Why do you need this? And ultimately that helps get to some of the more core issues. Like, if I can give an example, I was getting a request forever to create a like 0 through 5 index that scores people on social versus behavioral risk, right? And that was the ask. And I could have spent a good amount of time looking into our data artifacts related to behavioral versus social, how you would distinguish between those two. But what I ended up doing was just continuously asking about the divide between, like, why is this divide important? Why do you need behavioral versus social? What is driving this difference? And ultimately what we found was somebody above that person wanted the divide, but ultimately the same end user would be doing the intervention, right? So on that end, like 5 whying your stakeholder to understand exactly what they're looking for is super helpful. On the other side, I am a strong believer in data-driven exploration. So usually rather than, once you have that question, that really well articulated, like we need to know what the leading indicators that influence whether or not a person will convert are, that is where I usually engage with an analyst or a data scientist and try and stay out of their way and to the most, or to the ability possible, because ultimately, in my experience, they will find solutions that I never would have thought of using their techniques. So usually what I'll do there is like spend a couple days like beating my stakeholder down, asking a ton of questions, and then like put in a spike ticket for like a 3-day exploration to answer the question and time bound the hell out of it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. That was helpful. I'll ask, I had 2 more, and then just another note to attendees, feel free to drop your questions in the chat, or if you want to come off mute, feel free. So my second question was, I thought it was really interesting that you mentioned like getting people to align on definitions. So for me, I'm not in healthcare, so I'm in the education space. So my definitions might be slightly different, but for example, getting people to align on things like, what do you mean by monthly active users, or by time on task that a student spends on, say, a test or on an assignment. And I think it can be like everyone has wildly different definitions sometimes of what those mean. So do you have any advice on how to get stakeholders to align on those definitions, especially when they kind of cross many different teams?
Yeah. The best thing that I've seen work here actually is to leave it constantly open. And what I mean by that is essentially having like periods of time where I'll revisit definitions. In my case, it was actually, let me rephrase, to plug it into your example, what I would probably do is at the start of the year, say, here are definitions, BAUs, MAUs, time on task, etc. But then I would also keep an ongoing team of maybe it's 1 executive, 1 boot on the ground, 1 technologist to touch base on those every so often, so that when people do feel like that they have a legitimate beef, there's a forum for it. And also because sometimes definitions do drift. I guess what my high level piece of advice there is, they're probably right. There probably are changes that can be made. Acknowledge them. Don't change it often, but always be willing to listen. I think it's a little more sensitive with things like DAUs, MAUs, but ultimately, you've got to give people the space to believe that they can influence these, but you can't be altering them too often.
Yeah, there's one other.
Sorry, go ahead.
There's one other related question is, how can those of us who are not data PMs by title still be good stewards and champions of leveraging data for business needs? So similar to that.
Love that question. Oh, all right. Yes, I absolutely love that question. I think the biggest thing that I would ask is trying to internalize some of this data framework. I'll just tell you, right? I have had many lost hours and just like complainy evenings with my director of data science when we are often asked to deliver like advanced AI on raw data. So that's one thing. The other that I would say is oftentimes the work of these data PMs is then surfaced by the non-data PMs. I would say do everything you can to understand how that artifact, whatever you're surfacing, is generated. If you really understand the upstream lineage, it'll just give you a new appreciation for exactly how to surface and package the work of that team.
Great.
Hi, Michael. Myself, Ram, and I work as an analytics lead. And I have a quick question here. So basically, previously you're referring like, yeah, sometimes the problems could be very simple and practically, I mean, they could be solved by the existing talent or infrastructure which the client or company has. But sometimes some misguidance happens and they spent like a lot of millions or bring some Cadillac type of heavy engines to solve it, which is really not needed actually. So that was a very good example. Like it really relates to the existing business scenarios. So my quick question here is, so you might be aware of multiple analytics tools like we have Power BI or Tableau, which are like self-service analytics. And for operational reporting, we use like Oracle BI or SAP Business Objects. So my question is, for operational reporting, do you think we can leverage Power BI or Tableau for the same?
Yeah, I actually have used Power BI or Looker personally for operational reporting. So back when I was at Wellframe, we used Looker to power not only our internal operational reports, but also the reports that we templatized and kind of sold off as a value add.
Okay.
So I'm less familiar with Power BI, but what I did find with Looker was if you can get the right analysts who are SQL pros and who can learn that proprietary LookML code, you can do anything that you need to do there, like by and large. So in my experience, Looker at least has been great. Power BI has been useful. I have less experience with Tableau.
Oh, okay, got it. Yeah. Thank you, Michael.
No problem. Thank you, Ram.
Yeah, thank you. And
oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go with your question.
Okay. So my name is Lopa. I run a product group, and we mainly focus on functionality, and we're starting to go down the path of data and AI, right? My question to you, Michael, and thank you for the great presentation. What sort of structure do you see? How many data and analytics PMs do we need per functional PM, or do you expect separate, or like how does the org structure look like?
That's a great question, and it's something that I think it's something that the industry is kind of trying to figure out. What I would recommend early stage is a very curious PM and an analyst. And the first set of questions when you're moving from like that, like we are an application that is, you know, transactional and serving a function as opposed to the AI use case is, okay, the data is currently stored to service our transactions, to service our application. Now we have to think about how do we transform that data to run analytics to ask questions, right? It's going to be tempting to first go to like, well, can't we use that data to predict the cool thing we want to predict? But the first question is, okay, how do we define some of these core functions? And that's what you're going to need, like an analyst, a PM, and a subject matter expert too, depending on what you're doing. If you're trying to like predict the likelihood of, you know, on-time pizza delivery, you don't need an SME. If it is like personalized healthcare, you probably do. So that's what I would recommend. Start small, PM and analyst, maybe an SME.
All right, thank you very much.
No problem. And see if we can pop through. I'm sure there were other questions in the chat.
There's one other question. What kind of experiments do data PMs run? And how do the timelines look like, especially as they have to go build pipelines to gather experiment-specific data?
It's a great question, Mohan. So I'll give a few examples of the tests that I've done. Mohan put his finger on the pulse there. A solid 20% of my job is A/B testing. So here are a few from the past year. The first one would be A/B testing 2 different approaches to quantify patient risk, one driven by cost and one driven by condition. What we wanted to know was how accurately were we able to quantify risk in the context of a clinical observation. What I mean there is, how do you think about, I think Mohan's question here is actually great. When you think about quantifying risk, how do you know if Juliana is high risk or low risk, right? How do you know if Michael is high risk or low risk? What is right? If I said Michael is a 5 and he's on palliative care and has cancer, he's probably a 5. But if Mike has mild cancer in remission, he's probably between a 2 and a 3, right? So what we did was build A/B tests where we had access to several hundred doctors, and we were able to present, hey, here's the risk-driven model and here's the condition-driven model. Can you confirm, is this member a 5 or a 4, a mild or a moderate, right? And we were then able to determine that actually, like in accordance with like how doctors observe this, the condition-specific approach made more sense. Another A/B test would be, we create a predictive model that identifies how likely a member is to engage with our service. So I want to see, like Prachi is a 5 out of 5 to engage with us, right? So we might take 2 separate models, 2 different ways to quantify how we predict engagement, give them to 2 separate teams, and then see how effective those 2 onboarding approaches are. To Mohan's point, one of the biggest pain points is, how do you get that data back, right? Like, if you don't already have clear pipelines in place, then that can be very difficult. So now directly, Mohan, to your question, I would say for early stage companies, you've got to be just scrappy as hell. You don't build the pipelines, essentially. I have seen that done in messy forms through like low no-code apps or Excel sheets, or essentially like manual SQL work, right? Ultimately, as a startup emerges, what I have found to be irreplaceable for most companies is an experimentation platform, right? At CityBlock is a good example. We actually built the ability to test multiple models within anywhere that we did have an existing data pipeline, right? So if I am going to surface risk score X to our doctor, I can use that same pipeline to do A/B testing. That is something that as companies become more mature, I think is critical. Great. And I see another question came in, Johnny Jefferson.
I can read it. During the presentation, you mentioned wishing you knew some of the knowledge you have now earlier. Are there any resources that you would recommend that really helped you grow in your career? Books, podcasts, etc.
Yes. So books, anything, Marty Kagan, always. If you are going to go into the machine learning AI route, this is called the 100-page machine learning book by Andrei Burkov. It is light, it is easy to read, and you honestly, like, I am a humanities major with an MBA, all right? I am not a data scientist by trade. I read that book and walked out with data scientists calling me technical in nature. I am not. So yeah, +1 for everything, Marty Kagan. So those are the ones that I found helped there. The other thing that I would recommend is a pretty big influencer called Cassie Kosharoff. I will type that name here. She is the lead decision intelligence scientist at Google. She posts amazing content on how to templatize products. Oh, the first one was inspired by Marty Kagan. And 100-page machine learning book by Andrei Burkov. And as I said, the last one was anything. She's got her own blog and is incredibly active on LinkedIn. Highly recommend the follow of Cassie Kosharoff. And oh yeah, podcast too, just for fun. Everything Pivot. I just really enjoy listening to Kara Swisher, Scott Galloway, just fun tech and business news. right, let me see if we have any other, oh, welcome.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions. Feel free to type your question in the chat or come off mute.
All right.
I have one last question before we end, Michael. So for an organization that's not data-driven traditionally, what would you recommend would be the right approach for them to move towards becoming a data-driven organization?
Yeah, so my biggest advice is kind of start low and derive levels of, or derive value from all layers of that pyramid. So if you are just getting into like the AI data space, you have got so much unmined data that you are going to find, like you're going to find accidental value all over the place if you kind of just do what we talked about here. Like get an analyst whose job is not to deliver value to consumers, right? Get an analyst whose job is to deliver value to you as the PM, and who is constantly exploring the data to find like weird little correlations or weird little happenings. That would be step one. Like just get very curious people who are not focused on customer delivery, who are focused on generating insight internally. Usually just those things that, like, I'm not joking, like a 24-year-old analyst will accidentally find will be interesting enough to justify the investment in a more advanced data scientist.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. I think I've learned a lot from this presentation. Thank you so much for putting together the presentation and walking us through your experience. Before we end today's event, I would like everyone to take a look at the survey and fill out the survey. It will help us to bring more speakers and other topics that you might be interested in. The recording of this session and the notes, I'll post it on the BPMA website. Thank you again, everyone, and a big thank you to Michael.
Thank you all very much. I appreciate your time. Great
Bye,
afternoon,
everyone.
everybody.
Have a good day. Bye.